Welcome to our online chat entitled Celebrating Neurodiversity in Business. Obviously this week it is a Neurodiversity Celebration Week, and that's the reason that we've put on this afternoon's chat. So welcome to everyone. I'm Leanne Maguire. I am This Is Milk's Comms and Communities Manager. And like I've said, this week we are celebrating Neurodiversity Celebration Week. And it's a way for us as colleagues, as friends, as family members to celebrate the strengths and talents and raise awareness of lived experiences of neurodiversity individuals. So as part of that celebration, we wanted to share with you our experiences at This Is Milk and how we encourage inclusion across our team, and that we recognise those different skills and expertise that each of our colleagues has, and how that can complement each other for our common purpose. So with me today, I've got three of our colleagues. They'll all introduce themselves in a minute, and today's chat will be recorded. So if you enjoy what you hear today, feel free to share it when it's available with your colleagues, share it far and wide. I just want to start off today's chat because I know that we're going to get into this a bit deeper about the different terms that are used, particularly around neurodiversity. And even as a comms professional, it can be quite difficult to know what's the correct terms to be used. So our chat is open today, and it would be great to hear from you what your thoughts are as we talk through today's session. So please share your thoughts on any of the questions that we raised today or any of the points that you hear. I will try and pick up some of those comments as we go through. And if you've got any questions, again, pop them into the chat. And if we have some time, we'll try and catch up with some of those questions and see if any of my colleagues on the call can answer them. So I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourself. If we can go Angela, Peter, then Joe, and then we'll get started on some of our questions.
Okay, I'm Angela Printer-Smith. I'm the Managing Director of This Is Milk. Neurodiversity has become a huge topic for us. As we kind of embarked on our journey of creating an immersive learning environment, what we learned very quickly is actually one of the big pain points of education and learning was the one-size-fits-all approach, which led us down a road of really getting into the concepts around neurodiversity and how different brains work, and how can we teach and how can we learn in those different ways. It's also a topic close to my heart because I myself, I have a diagnosis, or an identification is the term I kind of prefer. And I'm probably missing some diagnoses as well. It's also, I have a completely neurodiverse team and family. So I have a dyslexic son and husband. I have a brother with ADHD and likely autism. I have a niece and nephew with ADHD. And I have been pursuing an ADHD diagnosis for one of my children, which has been a real battle. So this is a personal passion of mine, and I've been getting more and more immersed in the movement that is neurodiversity, and also the practices that make a kind of inclusive working environment. So that's me. So I'll pass over to Leanne. Who do you want me to go to? Peter. To Peter.
Hello, Peter Zielinski. I am the CTO at This Is Milk, heavily involved in the construction of Neve, how we're building it, how we're making it, accessible to neurodiverse population with everything. My passion is mostly around teams and building teams, neurodiverse teams. I've always believed that teams really need to have a lot of diversity in them, not just as far as people's brains are concerned, but overall. And neurodiversity, I think, fits in really well with that as well. I do have a severely mentally disabled child who has numerous diagnoses, including learning disabilities and autism. And I think it's important to include individuals who have both diagnosed and non-diagnosed neurodiversity features in the workplace. So that's pretty much me. I'll pass it over to Joe.
Hello, yeah, so I'm Joe Trickus. I'm the product manager on Neve, which is the immersive learning platform Angela referenced that we're building here at This Is Milk. So yeah, for me, neurodiversity has been an interesting topic. It's always been something I've been subjected to. I was one of those people that I had no struggle in school. So from a objective or like a science perspective, you might say I'm neurotypical, but then if you work with me or if you know me, you'd probably be like, really? So being in this position, we're looking at the product management of a neurodiverse first learning platform. I'm just, yeah, very much enjoying it. And the key for me being, I have that lived experience of being subjected to that one size fits all approach. And I was just one of the lucky ones who, because of like latent whatever, didn't struggle to get the grades, but I struggled in many other ways in terms of self-esteem, my own sort of self-worth, because there was just no time to look at me. And yeah, as a child, you kind of need that. So for me, yeah, to actually have the opportunity to make an impact for others that were like me, that have had that shared experience. And it turns out through this process, there's loads of people that are having that experience. It seems to be actually kind of the average is that experience. It's just at different ends of an experience. So yeah, yeah, that's my sort of thoughts on my exposure to and involvement in neurodiversity.
Thanks, folks, and thanks for sharing some of your own personal experiences. So we're going to go through some questions just to kind of celebrate This Is Milk and our inclusion and diversity within our team and how that actually benefits our team. We'll also get a wee bit into Neve and the development of it that we've already touched on. So Angela, for you first, we often speak about how our team is so diverse and inclusive. How have you seen this as a strength of the team?
I think having a diverse team, firstly, it takes effort. It takes effort to recruit in a certain way. It takes effort to lead the company a certain way that makes it okay, firstly, for people to come as themselves. So therefore, we know that they think differently, that their lived experience might be different than our own. And I think what we see is the benefit of having a team that can come to work as themselves and actually show us their diversity means that we get multiple perspectives on lots of things. It also means that we have to tolerate behaviors that we wouldn't necessarily expect in some environments. So we have to become very tolerant with each other. Tolerance, of course, builds empathy. Empathy, of course, builds creativity and understanding and better collaboration. And with all of that, we're solving problems better and we're solving better problems, right? So we're uncovering people's truths and we're uncovering different ways of looking at any particular thing. What I do want to caveat all of that with is nobody can get this right all the time. You know, and there probably are some people that wouldn't want to work in our environment, right? And then it kind of begs the question of, well, actually, there is only so much inclusivity that we can actually bring, because there are certain jobs that need to be done, and there are certain people that are equipped to do those jobs and certain people that aren't. But with all of it, I think allowing people to be themselves and therefore knowing their diverse viewpoints, their diverse modes of operating, their diverse behaviours provides us with ground to innovate better.
Thanks, Angela. Joe, I'm going to come to you next. I know we've had this conversation quite often in the office, across the team, and we see it a lot across social media and media, where neurodiversity individuals often maybe term themselves as having a superpower. And I just wanted to ask, what's your thoughts if you think labelling people with a superpower is a good way of celebrating neurodiversity?
Yeah, I mean, it's nuanced, definitely. So I can completely see the value of recognizing the upsides without a doubt. But I feel like it can also send the message that it's just a superpower, right? Like, we live in a world that talks about Marvel and real superpowers and stuff. I know it's all fantasy, but it is part of our lexicon of speech. And so that's the only area that I often find, you know, a lot of the time, the reason that these things do carry a diagnosis, like an actual clinical diagnosis, is because there are many detracting elements to that person's life or limitations that they have to learn to navigate that aren't superpowers, frankly. So that's the only area where I feel like using that terminology too flippantly can just completely sort of not see people's struggles. And then, yeah, from my personal lived experience, like, there are certain things my brain can do that others would say are superpowers, and yet what I see is the other side of that. Like, I see the problems it introduces to my life, right? So yeah, that's basically what I was just saying before, but a little bit of flavor of why, because I've experienced that. People say that's amazing that you can do that. I'm like, yeah, but it also means I dwell on this other thing for 40 hours a week. So
yeah. And it's interesting because I suppose that's what makes us all unique. It's whatever makes us feel comfortable and able to maybe process a diagnosis better, if that helps some people to say that it is their superpower. I know that in some of our conversations around education, it's used a lot with younger people as well, with pupils at school, and it's maybe just a way of trying to relate it in a way that they understand. So it's an interesting conversation, and if anyone who's watching has any thoughts on it, feel free to add your thoughts to the chat. We'd love to hear what your thoughts are about it, if you would use that term, or if you shy away from it. Jo, sorry, did you want to add anything else to that there?
No, that's all right. I was going to, but it's all right. It feels like we're good.
That's okay. Okay, Peter, I'm going to come on to you next. So in your experience, you've got vast experience working across the kind of tech sector. And I wanted to ask you if there were certain roles, again, I know we've had this discussion in work often, if there are certain roles where diversity actually is a benefit to you in some of these roles, because particularly some of the neurodiversity diagnosis that we hear of, that there may be certain roles where that's actually seen as a strength, and would benefit you in that working role. What's your thoughts on that?
That's a very interesting question, because I really don't think of neurodiversity as so. There's this aspect of, for example, superpowers, like you just mentioned, right? And so people would think, okay, well, if you have this superpower, suddenly you're able to do this thing that normal people aren't able to do. And I really want to kind of shy away from that idea that people who have some diagnosis necessarily have a superpower, because people without a diagnosis will also have those abilities. So I think of it more as what abilities do people have and how they would fit in those roles, right? And the other thing is diagnosis often collects up a whole bunch of features and then puts them and says, oh, well, you have all of this, so therefore you have this diagnosis. On the other hand, things like in certain populations with certain neurodiverse feature sets, there exist certain abilities, and those abilities do lend themselves really well to certain places in software development. For example, people who have dyslexia. The reason they have dyslexia, in my understanding of it, is that they can turn things in 3 dimensions really well. So 3D modeling for them would be so much easier than someone who has aphantasia and can't even picture items in their mind, right? Those kinds of things. So you have 2 different spectrums of that one lends itself really well to 3D modeling. For example, there's other neurodiverse features that lend themselves really well to sitting and focusing on a single task, right? People who need to debug and are, so software development as it stands and debugging, that lends itself really well because they dive in and they can sit there for 12 hours and figure out why something isn't working. People who are really adept at detail, very detail oriented. Again, there are numerous kind of diagnoses that have this feature that are where people are able to really look at the details of everything. So testing, QA, those kinds of things. I don't necessarily think that people with diagnoses are well suited. It's just if you have this particular feature, that would lend itself to those really well.
Yeah, thanks. And I think the main point is that inclusion is a good thing, that nobody should be excluded from a role because of X, Y, or Z, because we're not just talking about neurodiversity as a whole. Just any human being, they will have certain skills and traits that are better developed for certain roles. So excluding someone just because they don't tick a box isn't always necessarily the same route to go. I think that's the kind of point that we're getting at. So we've already touched on our Neve learning platform, so I want to find out a wee bit more about that from you. So this is Milk. We do have lived experience throughout our team, and I think that's been really beneficial in the development of the platform, because obviously Neve's goal is to promote a future learning that is more inclusive and equitable by prioritising neurodiversity principles in its approach. So Angela, if I can come to you first of all, why was it important to develop a learning platform with neurodiversity principles first?
I mean, from a commercial perspective, it was the gap. It was the gap in the market, right? And I'm a business person, so ultimately, I went where I saw a gap. And the research kept telling us that it wasn't the challenge that the Scottish Government gave us through the CivTech thing, but it's what the people were telling us. What we learned was that the way learning was delivered through workplace based things didn't suit a lot of people. And we keep replicating the same modes of teaching and learning that we've all learned through the education system. And I think what we need to reflect on is actually a lot of the labels that we give people are really as a result of not fitting to that mode of teaching and learning. Because really our first big indoctrination into society is through the education system. And really where people first start to get picked up as diverging from the typical is through that education system. So in saying that a person is not typical, it's basically saying they cannot cope with this education system in the way that we would expect them to. So given the levels of brain differences that are, we have 4 different brains here. Neurodiversity is everybody, right? Neurodiversity takes up everyone in the population. It is not a thing that I feel like I can claim or anybody else can. The whole purpose of that movement is to say that there is a tapestry of humanity whose brains all work in different ways. Unfortunately, the systems that we have don't suit a lot of people for whatever reasons, and they institutionalize exclusion, right? So that was the big challenge that we didn't see anybody else trying to solve. And we have abilities now through software to do something different, right? And to at least try and tackle that big problem. So it was a big, hairy, audacious goal to try and solve this big problem of how do you create learning that isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And from a lot of the reading that I've done, we are becoming less typical, right? I don't like using the word neurotypical because I think it's othering, and neurodiversity should be about inclusion, but we are becoming more closely related to autism, ADHD, and the labels around that. Our brains are actually getting more diverse and more divergent. So this is only going to become a bigger problem because we keep trying to do things in the same way that we've always done them. So that is more people being traumatized by systems that were not designed for difference. So that is the big goal that we're trying to make. but it's really important to me. And I don't think we can, I wasn't diagnosed with anything until I was in my late 20s. And it was like a penny drop that I went, oh, right, that's why life was so hard, right? That's why that stuff was so hard for me. It wasn't until a few years ago that I realized that those differences in my brain also did bring with it my strengths. And I just consider myself exceptional now. I'm an exception to lots and lots of rules, right? But the education system, despite the fact that I had an IQ of 174, I did not do that well in school. And I was excluded, and I found socializing very difficult. And there were lots and lots of things that made me feel like an outsider. And I carried a burden of minority stress, right? Because I was not included in that school environment in a way that made me feel welcome. So I have that personal passion, and now it's just I'm a warrior fighting for nobody else to have to experience that either, whether that be in the workplace or whether that be at school.
Thanks, Angela. Peter, I'm going to come on to you next to actually talk a wee bit more about the design of Neve and what kind of considerations have been made to try and stick to those neurodiversity first principles.
So overall, there are
Sorry,
a lot
I should
of
have said that was in terms of building Neve. Jo, I'm going to come on to you about the design. I think I get my questions mixed up.
That's okay. So when we're building, I think the considerations are that things just take a little bit longer because we have to look at what is out there. Sometimes it means having to build controls that don't exist to make sure that everyone can access them, right? Which takes more time, which is perfectly reasonable, but it's just a matter of time and noticing that there isn't something out there that we can plug in, because there isn't, for example, a control that helps you enter a date effectively, and will allow everyone with all sorts of different abilities and disabilities to enter a date and select the correct proper date, and how that will then read back to you and all of that. So those are kind of the considerations that we're doing and we have to take into account. The other thing is certain features of neurodiversity are counter to each other, which means we now have to provide two options, right? So we have to provide multiple options. So again, that extends how much time it's going to take, because we have to provide multiple things for people to be able to choose how they want to accomplish something. On the other hand, certain things are a lot easier because we can make things very simple, and it will, if you're looking at it from a point of view of, if you look at neurodiversity first, as in what is the minimum thing that will meet a requirement, it's a lot easier than to, as Angela says, neurotypical is a really bad word because it doesn't match, but individuals who kind of fit into that, where they're okay with the standard, right? They can usually manage, or it's even beneficial to them to have this neurodiverse view on things, or the implementations. Whereas, so it's actually better for everyone across the board by it being simpler.
Thanks, Peter. And Jo, I suppose a similar question to you in terms of the design of the platform. How are you keeping the neurodiversity principles first?
So the biggest exercise is definitely user testing. So giving the designs or the products to people that will use it and finding out what they tell us about it. But also most important, like coupled with that, the anecdotal feedback's very valuable, but also any analytical feedback we can look at, because quite often people might say they're feeling something, but then we can see a different perspective in the data. So that's one of the primary activities that we actively do to ensure that we're not just operating on theory, right? Because this is one of the biggest risks in this, is you could spend thousands of hours reading research papers about particular cases in very controlled environments, but then when you actually go into the real world with real people, that doesn't always like play out. So I find, yeah, user testing's one of the most valuable actionable steps you can take. There's also the education piece, though. It's not to say we don't read anything, you know. You've also got to be looking at the different perspectives before you build anything around the direction we could head in, what would likely be useful to different groups of people. And as Peter rightly called out, how those, if there are like any push and pull or opposing ideals, then how can we start to cater for that? Which is most often build the one that meets the greatest number of people and then work back from there, because you have to start somewhere, right? So, yeah.
Thanks. So we've obviously touched on Neve a little bit there, and if you're interested in finding out any more about Neve, or even you'd be interested in seeing a demo of Neve, then please get in touch and we'd be happy to arrange that for you. I've got one last question for today, and that's for Angela. In your experience, what advice would you give to businesses to ensure that they're being inclusive in their recruitment, but also in their day-to-day operations?
It is such a big question. I think it starts with being very honest with yourself about what the actual skills you need for a job are. So for example, if you are recruiting for somebody who's going to be managing a lot of people and a lot of customers, yes, that person is going to need strong interpersonal skills. However, if you've got somebody working in a data entry role that is not required to manage a lot of people or work with customers, are interpersonal skills actually a really important thing? So keeping that premise of really asking yourself, what is it you're trying to achieve at any given point along your journey of recruitment and beyond, will give you an answer. So the whole recruitment process is very geared for recruiting people like us. Like it's actually geared for that. And as long as we continue to recruit people like us, we're just creating our own echo chamber, right? And then you're never going to get those benefits of diversity. So I think that being really honest with yourself about what it is that you're actually doing, what is it that you're trying to achieve with that role, with that recruitment process, whatever it is, and then checking as to whether it is testing for the right things. Are you asking for the right things? And then being, when that person arrives, making sure that you are tolerant, right? Like, does it matter that somebody needs to do yoga stretches throughout the day? No, it doesn't. It is not impacting what they're doing in terms of their job. Therefore, tolerate it, right? So really questioning yourself about what do you really need and what do you don't need? Because there is also the flip side of this, like, by recruiting people into roles that do not suit them, you're going to create stress for them. It's actually not a good place for them to be. So for me personally, I would really struggle with a job like testing, because I find the repetitive nature of that, I couldn't do it. Like, I can do it for short spells and that's about it. So that would put me under a lot of stress. So recruiting me into a role because of my witty personality in an interview that is then going to end up with me having to work through processes is just going to create a bad working environment for me. So again, that comes down to that honesty and that being really critical about what it is that you're trying to do. And genuinely, our workplace isn't the right place for a lot of people, right? So we need to be actually very honest about that as well. Inclusive in terms of a workplace does not mean you have a place for everybody, because putting them in that place might actually be the wrong thing for them as well as you.
Yeah, no, some good points made there. So just going to wrap up there. So just a reminder that Neurodiversity Celebration Week is an awareness week where we look to shift the focus from the challenges and to the many strengths and talents of neurodivergent individuals. At This Is Milk, we see how important it is to harness strengths and talents of our colleagues by building their confidence and self-esteem and ensuring that everyone is given an opportunity to flourish, which in turn helps us as a business. So thank you for joining us today. We hope the conversation was helpful. And if you'd like to hear more information about anything that we discussed today, then please reach out and get in touch. Thanks.